The St. Tammany Parish John Doe, 1993, identified as Joseph Muniz. This story begins on October 29, 1993, when squirrel hunters were out in what was described as a swampy woodland area located along railroad tracks near Interstate 59 in the Pearl River Wildlife Management Area, which is in Louisiana. It was here that a man was found in the Pearl River Wildlife Management Area, and this is 2 miles away from the Mississippi state line. The area itself was heavily wooded. Scavengers had really messed up the scene, and they only located a skull and some of the skeleton. They did find what they described as a unique pair of eyeglasses, as well as some articles of clothing. They would estimate the man was about 5'6" to 5'8", or 168 to 173 centimeters tall, and likely around 25 to 38 years of age. They were unable to estimate even his hair color, so they would send his remains off to the LSU Faces Lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and this was meant for further testing and, of course, a recreation of what he might have looked like. The recreations that were done on this case can be seen here. There were actually multiple done from 1993 to 2003, but no one came forward with information to identify him. There was significant trauma noted to his right hip area, and it was likely this happened shortly before he passed, believing that the break may have led to a limp and possible back pain. The authorities hoped this would help with identification. They would state that his COD was caused by an item that, for YouTube, I will just say, begins with a G and rhymes with run, and this happened to the rear area of his head. While he was found in October of 1993, they aren't quite sure when he passed, but they didn't believe it was longer than 6 months earlier, which was April of 1993. As they searched for who the John Doe was, the case would stall, and they would eventually request assistance of the coroner's forensic DNA lab. And they ran those results through CODIS, which, as I've mentioned before, is the cheaper option of processing DNA, looking for matches. They also uploaded the case to NamUs, and they began searching to families who submitted DNA of missing loved ones. Unfortunately, this didn't work, and they would end up having to opt for a more expensive sample in order to use genetic genealogy. In April of 2023, they would receive a grant from the Season of Justice in order to pay for processing through Othram Labs. But then, of course, began the complicated process of getting DNA that was suitable for processing. It was a difficult process, but it paid off, and the DNA led to 2 possible siblings of the man in question, with both living in Burnsville, Minnesota. These possible siblings would donate their DNA, and it was a match. His siblings would confirm to the police that Joseph Lee Muniz was born in January of 1972. Joseph was just 21 when his life was taken. His family had believed he was somewhere in Louisiana when he disappeared in 1993, which means he was a 17-hour drive from home, around 1,190 miles, or 1,920 kilometers. If more comes out on this case, I will insert it here now as an editor's note. The only other information I've found so far is they identified a possible suspect as the perpetrator. However, unfortunately, that person has already passed away. Joseph Lee Muniz went unidentified for 30 years. Had he lived, he would be 51 years old today. Adam, Victim 3, also known as Victim A, identified as Keith Lavell Bibbs. The young man known as Adam, Victim 3 or Victim A, was one of the unknown decedents attributed to a serial named Larry Eiler, who was active in the 1980s. He was allegedly picked up in Terre Haute, Indiana, by Eiler somewhere around July 10th to 16th in 1983. Eiler offered $75 to the young man for specific services that I can't mention here. His remains were eventually found near a man named Johnny Brandenburg Jr., who was identified in 2021. I generally try to say as little about serials as I can because I feel like I give them power if I promote them. So rather than say a lot here, I've provided a couple of links with information about him in the description below. So to keep it short in saying anything about him, I will say he took the lives of a minimum of 21 young men between 1982 and 1984. He picked these men up, offered them money, and would instead take their lives. He would eventually be arrested and sentenced to pay for his crimes with his life. However, before that could even happen, he would pass from an AIDS-related illness. The things that he was known to do to these young men are described as sadistic and cruel. He especially preyed on those who were already at risk for being victimized. It seems that a lot of these young men, in these cases with Eiler, Dahmer, Gacy, many of them had been rejected by family and were just existing on the streets. I don't know for sure what Keith Bibbs' life was like, but the sad thing here is there's only one photo of him, at least as I record my audio. I have to admit it makes me hope that he was loved and accepted. Sometimes families are just private and they don't release pictures, and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. Thanks to the DNA, we now know he disappeared 1 year before he was even officially an adult. He was from Chicago, Illinois, and he had been found in Newton County, Indiana, which was about 85 miles or 137 kilometers away from home. Eiler's MO was to drug them and take their lives with what I'll just describe as a sharp implement. The photo shown here lists a group of men who lost their lives. If we could take a moment to acknowledge their loss, this column shows their names, which is incredibly sad. These men would now be in their 50s and 60s today if they'd lived. And if you consider this was just a 2-year snapshot in time, that's a lot of people who were just starting out. Thankfully, he was caught before there was even more devastation. Keith Bibbs went unidentified for 39 years. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 56 years old today. The Charlotte John Doe, 1988, identified as Oliver Doc Mundy, who went by the name OD. This one begins in Charlotte, North Carolina on February 9th, 1988. This was at a building on North Tyrone Street near East 6th Street. The building itself was once one of Charlotte, Carolina's nicest hotels. The Dunhill Hotel in Charlotte had originally been the Mayflower Hotel. However, the hotel itself became run down and was losing business until it was fully abandoned in 1981. Then in 1988, it would be reopened with a facelift by a real estate developer. This was eventually rebranded as the Dunhill Hotel, and the hotel itself has a reputation for being haunted, whether you believe in that or not. The remodel was started, and shortly after this, they began working on the elevator. It was here, at the bottom of the elevator shaft, that his remains were found. If they know how long his remains were there, which you often hear me refer to as the postmortem interval, so this would be the time between when he passed and when he was found. But I can't find any mention of how long they believe he'd been there. The framing in many of the reference articles I found suggested that he jumped. The site that speaks about the haunting of this hotel, or the presumed haunting of this hotel, has an article that I've linked to in the description below. According to that site, a mysterious skull was discovered in the basement, which appears, now that we know what we know, to be a pretty inaccurate framing, but it probably adds to the drama of the story that was being told. And according to them, from this building, many people during the Depression jumped off the top of the building. The foreshadowing here was a little bit interesting, as according to the authorities, there seems to be a belief that he jumped into the elevator shaft. But it's important to mention that it's not uncommon for transients to enter a building that's been abandoned, and accidents happen. It would be 34 years after he was found in June of 2022 that a bone sample was taken to a lab in Texas, and this was from a lab in North Carolina, which is of course the state where our John Doe was found. So for all of that time, his remains were in a storage box waiting for the right time and a new technology. By May of 2023, they had identified him, making the announcement in June of this year. We know now the man that went by the name of OD was actually Oliver Doc Mundy, who was born in July of 1923. He eventually enlisted in the service and served in World War II. Unfortunately, OD disappeared around 1980, so it's possible he'd been in that elevator shaft around 8 years. If OD passed away around the time he went missing, he would have been only 56 years old. On the date he was found, he would have been 64. OD's niece, Becky, would speak out saying, "My life has felt like a roller coaster. I'm between a 2020 episode and a Lifetime movie." She told reporters at WCNC that she was grateful to finally know. She went on to explain she was 11 the last time she saw her uncle. He also fought several key battles in World War II, and he had a hard time processing his memories as he returned from the war. And this would haunt him to the point where he ended up sleeping in the street, she would say. Her father, who was OD's little brother, worried a lot about his brother. Becky went on to say that her uncle was honorable and brave. Her father died never knowing what happened to OD. She would say this was sad for her, but she was glad to finally know herself. She was quoted as saying, "It's been so long, and just to get his remains back with us, my plan is to put my uncle with my dad where he needs to be. That would make my dad so happy." OD earned several medals and 2 Bronze Stars. OD Mundy was a missing person for 43 years, and an unidentified John Doe for 35. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you are at all interested in helping crowdfund John and Jane Doe cases, I've provided links to the DNA Doe Project and DNA Solves below. Both of those allow you to pick the cases you help fund. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.